The Federation story. The background. For at least 50,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have lived on these lands and practiced traditional cultures and languages. From the late 1700s, British colonies were established, and by the late 1800s, these colonies had their own parliaments, though they were still subject to the law-making power of the British Parliament. The colonies were almost like 6 separate countries, with each having its own government and laws, its own defence force, its own tariffs on goods that crossed its borders. The colonies had even built railways using different gauges. By the 1880s, the inefficiency of this system, a growing unity among colonists, and a belief that a national government was needed to deal with the issues such as trade, defence and immigration, saw popular support for federation grow. Free trade. While tariffs provided the colonial governments with much revenue, they restricted trade and movement among the colonies. Tariffs increased the cost of goods and made it hard for manufacturers based outside a colony to compete with local producers. Trade restrictions also made travelling between colonies difficult. The train journey between Melbourne and Sydney was delayed at the border in Albury while customs officials searched passengers' luggage. Free traders were among the most vocal supporters of federation. They argued that abolishing tariffs and creating a single market would strengthen the economy of each colony. Defence. Prior to federation, the colonies were ill-equipped to defend themselves. Each colony had its own militia consisting of a small permanent force and volunteers, but they all relied on the British Navy to periodically patrol the Australian coastline. People feared the colonies could be vulnerable to attack from other nations with larger populations and military forces. The colonies thought a united defence force could better protect Australia. Immigration. In the late 19th century, many people did not support immigration from non-British countries. There was a real concern that cheap non-white labour would compete with colonists for jobs, leading to lower wages and a lower standard of living. These anxieties stem partly from anti-Chinese sentiment dating back to the goldfields of the 1850s. They also reflected resentment towards Pacific Islanders who worked in Queensland's sugar industry. At the time, racial conflict was seen as a consequence of a multicultural society. It was felt a national government would be in a better position than the colonies to control immigration. National pride. Colonists mostly shared a common language, culture and heritage, and increasingly began to identify as Australian rather than British. New South Wales Premier Sir Henry Parkes referred to this as the crimson thread of kinship that runs through us all. By federation in 1901, over 3/4 of the population were Australian-born. Many people moved between the colonies to find work, and sporting teams had begun to represent Australia. In 1899, soldiers from the colonies who went to the Boer War in South Africa served together as Australians. Contemporary songs and poems celebrated Australia and Australians.